Hello, I'm Terri Bailey of the Bailey Learning and Arts Collective and the Queen's Room Women's Empowerment Group. I'm also a poet and an Afrofuturist writer, and I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk about storytelling and social change because that's what I do. I try to, every venue I go in, every event I participate in, that is what my focus is. Telling my story and trying to elicit some change from someone, whether it's changing themselves or changing their environment. That is my goal, to help people also learn the value of their story. And so tonight we have an incredible panel of people. And I'm just going to pass the mic and let everyone introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Syraj Syed, and I am a narrative counseling and education specialist. I work with the Legal Empowerment and Advocacy Hub, as well as the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building. And my approach to story, why it's something that's so significant and through my own personal practice, but also in the practice that I work with a lot of people through, is because with story, and Brandon knows this well, we can author our own paths forward, author our stories forward. So self-authorship is the kind of basis of my work, and therefore the use of story is seminal, right? So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sharon Burney, and I am formerly worked at the University of Florida. I now in African American Studies, but I now work for an organization called the Council on Library Information Resources. And I am a poet / spoken word artist, writer, author. I understand the importance of storytelling in a variety of ways to allow us to advance culture, to be the historical landmarks for families and communities that are disenfranchised, and use it as an empowerment tool for not only oppressed people, but also to bring understanding and light to conversations that we are sometimes reluctant to have.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Iman Zawahry, and I am a filmmaker and professor at the University of Florida. I also created the first American Muslim film grant to fund emerging Muslim filmmakers to change the story and the narrative of Muslims in Hollywood today. And the stories that I tell to create social change are comedies, specifically about Muslim women, since there are none. And so that is the way that I hope to impart social justice on the community.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask everybody a series of questions. You give me your answer. Remember my finger? To keep us on track. I'm a big talker. I like to hear myself talk. And so I will also be using the timer to monitor myself. My first question is just the basic. What do you do in terms of storytelling to elicit social change, to create change in your environment, in your faith, your community, or even within your own family?
Thanks, Terri. So I'll give it, how about this? I'll tell a story to answer that question. Recently, like Wednesday of this week, I was in court at the Alachua Criminal Justice Center, having worked with an attorney and her client who was someone that had a litany of offenses, something that she had, kind of been involved in for the past 20 years since she was 18. She's 38 now. And in that courtroom, that was her story. That's what comprised her entire human existence, all of her expression. Everything was based on that particular, what essentially is the rap sheet, right? And we had the opportunity, working through the Legal Empowerment and Advocacy Hub, to be able to hold space within that courtroom and give testimony to tell another kind of story relative to this individual's human development, relative to her paths of change, the behavior change that she intentionalized for herself, and the way that she has constructed and co-constructed with others a different kind of life for herself, and also telling the context, right? Because context matters, the context of why she found herself in these particular situations and the offenses that she was charged with, not because this was something that came out of malicious intent or uncaring. It was out of a sense of survival, because she didn't know anything else and didn't know how to do anything else, and had been left behind relative to any kind of social capital that would have provided her the ability to do something else, like many of us in this room, I imagine. So that story and that change that occurred, because I'll tell you, the legal system doesn't look like Perry Mason and Matlock. I mean, there's not wonderful storytelling that happens all the time. It's basically, this is what you've done, this is how much you score for, this is how much you're punished, next case. And I sat through 33 cases before hers. Hers was the 34th that day. And it was brutal to see all of what happened, and it was very demoralizing. So I didn't really have a sense of a lot of hope, but hope prevailed at the end of that particular moment. And story had a lot to do with humanizing this individual from, differentiating from a piece of paper. So that's how story worked for me this week.
All right. Thank you.
I use poetry, but I use it to layer ideologies, to layer historical facts, to tell the story from a different perspective. I like to play with time. In some of my poems, I like to make you think. I'll write a story that I'll do a poem that you'll hear. You're going to miss some of it. I want you to come back to it and rate it, and then take the layers off of it and deconstruct it and construct it again. I will be touched by something that I see or read, or an experience somebody tells me, and then I want to take and give it a different lens that most people wouldn't give it, so that you can hear it. Because like I touched on earlier, when it's time to talk about race and embarrassing parts of history that we still don't want to acknowledge, we put walls up when we feel sensitive to it. So what I try to do is to create a story that pulls you in, and within a poem that will pull you in and make you pay attention to it, and then make you think about it. And then I want you to go home and think about it. And it's funny, I did a poem, I remember, and I'm going to go through this. I did a poem one time 10, 12 years ago. I remember I was on campus, and the idea behind the poem, I called it Blackface, but it was about people within our community that were selling out. But in one stanza, I made a comment about, I said Caucasian one time. And I had a woman walk up to me a month later and stop me and say, "You don't remember me?" And she was all upset. And you said Caucasian, and it was about white people. And I remember thinking to myself, I asked her what her name was, and I said, "Thank you for the compliment, because you're still thinking about it." And I said, and what it was really about was about this and this and this and that. I said, "But let me ask you a question. Are you Jewish? Because I take from your last name that possibly you are." And she said, "Yes." I said, "Would I go to," because this was during Black History Month that I did this poem, "but I would never go to Jewish History Month and ever suggest to you not to talk about Nazis or the Holocaust. So what made you feel that it was okay to come and tell me I can't talk about the people that have oppressed my people for so many years?" But those are the kind of the impacts that I want us to think, and I want people to walk away. So that's how I impact with social justice, because I make you think. And I want you to think later, and I want you to deconstruct it.
Nice, beautiful. So, as you guys know, the story of Muslims, and specifically Muslim women, thank you, Syraj, are of that of oppression or weak, or someone's beating them up, or some stones being in their face constantly. And, that was the story that I had to combat all my life. I was born and raised in Panama City, Florida, which is a very small, as you guys know, redneck town. And yes, Redneck Riviera, thank you. I'm sorry, that's me. So, growing up there, I grew up with 5 brown girls. We're all Arab Muslim, and we dealt with the barrage of negativity through comedy. You know the saying, if you know a Muslim, then you're okay with them, but if you don't, you're scared of them. And so growing up, we would always do kind of skits and stuff and whatnot, and I always thought to myself, the way to educate people is through knowledge, right? And I thought, academically. But when I came here for undergrad, I was like, okay, I'm going to get my PhD, and I'm just going to teach people through universities. And then I realized you're not going to be able to change, the person in the Midwest, their concepts of who I am by just looking at me through the college setting. So I decided to go to film school, and I didn't tell my parents because they're all doctors, and they wouldn't be super happy about it. So, and I didn't think I would get in because it's very difficult to get in, but I applied to FSU and I got in. And so I told my parents, and it's funny because even after I took them to the red carpet in LA for the Emmys, they were just like, are you taking your LSAT now? Are you going to take your MCAT now? Like constantly. But they finally, like 10 years later, now they're okay with it. But, when I went to film school, I was like probably one of 3 Muslim women that were in film at that time in America, which is very, very sad. So my shorts were very well received. I got an Emmy Award. I was a part to pitch NBC. I was part of Princess Grace. I mean, there was a whole thing because it was a story they'd never heard before. And one story in particular, thinking about the stories you guys have told us, I was at a film festival in Sarasota, Florida, which is a wealthy Jewish town, as you guys know. And one of my shorts showed, and I shouldn't call it Jewish town, but one of my shorts showed, and it was about a Palestinian Jewish conflict. That's what it was. And it was about like peace building. And so the woman stood up, started clapping really hard, and started crying and calling me the beacon of peace. And even though that was super awkward and uncomfortable, I was like, wow, we are getting somewhere. So every day with my students, with myself, as I work on my films, I always say, what story are you trying to tell? What part of yourself are you trying to tell? And how can you change the narrative?
Okay, wow. We're off to an awesome start. For me, as a storyteller, when I do a poem on gentrification or my power as a woman sexually, or even addressing domestic abuse, I always expect that it's going to be well received and everybody's going to praise me and love me for it, but that is not always the case. There is always somebody, like Sharon was talking about, that has some opposition. And sometimes when I was much younger and I would do a poem and somebody didn't like it, I would think I needed to alter it or change it somehow so I could make it, make people be more comfortable. So I might have 2 or 3 versions of a poem for different audiences, But since I'm now aging gracefully I decided that was not necessary, that, we can have a conversation about it. So my next question is, how do you tell your story, deal with opposition or negative emotion around what you said evokes, and stay relevant and true to your story?
So for me, that idea of opposition, negative intention, whatever that pushback is actually, it's methodologized, right? It's a part of the whole procedure, because for me, that is a moment that shakes up the narrative. It's dissonance. Everybody feels it. Everyone's uncomfortable and writhing in their chairs or within a particular space, whatever it is we're doing, a community conversation otherwise. And it's an important moment because it's within that dissonance. And usually I'm dealing with people that are ripe within a moment of crisis, right? So it's already that. And in that particular space, to help someone situate themselves in their narrative, to see themselves in the story, it's definitely not a comfortable space to be. It is a very dissonant space to be, but my firm belief and the way that I've kind of moved forward with in the practice that I've engaged in is that there's kind of a direct proportion between the amount of discomfort, the amount of dissonance, the displacement that someone is feeling, and the opportunity to recognize their own power to shift that narrative in that moment. So I think without that negativity, without the uncovering of the layers of negative thinking that someone may have or the community in which they exist, there's not really an understanding of that urgency for change, right? So that's something that I often find is the starting point. It's the way in. It's wherever that dissonance is, wherever that discomfort is. And if I tend now to come to a place where if I don't find that, then maybe I think the story's not going to be that interesting as it unfolds, right? We need some drama, conflict. Isn't that what it is? You know, that's what we seek in the kind of stories we tell, whether visual narratives or oral, whatever the case is. So there's never a shortage of that drama, and I'm thankful for it.
Thank you.
Terry's probably laughing because she knows I really don't care. I think, but I take a great responsibility when I write a poem, and most people may not realize that. So before I pick a subject or a viewpoint, I research it, I look at it from the different angles, and then I say, how am I going to get it to everybody in the audience? I have a poem that I did because I was tired of seeing stereotypes about black women. So I wrote a poem called Angry Black Woman, but I made it about everything but that. So I told the story of my ideal, and I actually graph it all out when I write a story, and then I need to make it beautiful too. I always want to make it beautiful. Even in the pain, it's going to be beautiful. And so I said, let me tell the story of a young woman, black girl, from the time she is born till she's an adult. And I want people to see how she sees herself, how society sees her, how society misrepresents her, how we enact it, how we manifest it, how we self-sabotage, in every aspect about what black women in. And then I end it with, and sometimes I'm angry. And I've had responses. I've had a middle-aged white man come up to me crying one time when I wrote the poem. I've had white women come up to me and say, I feel validated. I had a black man come up to me and tell me, you made me see my wife in a whole different way from that poem. So sometimes you don't have to have that experience. My goal is, whether you've had that experience as a writer, whether you can see or not see, is to make you see it. And that's what I try to do in my poetry. So I use my poetry for storytelling.
So I think every artist or anyone in the limelight has the haterade constantly. So, specifically with me, it's like within my own community. If you're not telling a story that they want you to tell, and that's not showing the humanistic side of who we are as people, and not this, we are the most perfect people in the world, then they get pretty upset about it. And of course, when I feel like I've given my life to this work, it obviously hurts, right? Especially from the people that I'm representing. So, of course, when I was younger, it really bothered me. But I would say 98% has been overtly supportive. I shouldn't say that it hasn't been. And I since I do live in a small Florida bubble, I feel like if I lived in a bigger city, it would be worse. But I've only gotten support in that sense. And so there's two things. It's my own community and then the overall industry community. Right now I'm dealing with this. I'm trying to get my feature film out there, and it's really hurtful because these larger film festivals really don't want to see comedies, especially about Muslims, I feel. They want to see the dramas, the grit, you know, and I'm making a lighthearted comedy about Muslim women in the Trump era. And so that's been something I'm learning and trying to navigate, especially in the community that's not, you know, considered my own. Like, I can talk to a level in the community of my own, or I can just hand it. But to the large powers to be, possibly the white men in charge, you know, that's a little bit more challenging for me. So I'm learning how to navigate that. And you asked how to stay relevant, and man, I'm gonna tell you, I'm trying to work on my Instagram game. It's hard to stay relevant. It's very hard to stay relevant. I can't even keep up with the terms that my students are telling me every day. I'm like, what are you using now? And so it's a little bit embarrassing, but I try to keep it up. And then I just own like my age. I'm just like, you know what, I'm old, that's fine. I said yo on accident once, and oh my gosh, they thought it was the funniest thing. And then the entire time on set, they just kept going, okay, dog, okay, yo. And I'm like, all right, this is fine. I'm very irrelevant. Irrelevant. But here you go.
That's funny. Because that Instagram thing, you know, they drug me kicking and screaming to Instagram.
Yeah, that's a third job.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just old and Facebookish. You know, I have a Facebook family for sure.
Yeah.
So, right now, I have two big focuses, okay? I am committed to bringing an awareness about gentrification. And so I am born and raised and currently live in Pleasant Street, Gainesville's oldest historically Black community. And there are no Black people left over there. There are very, very few. And it's heartbreaking. So I write a lot, and I mean a lot of poems about that. I talk about it at every turn. And also I am committed to healing, primarily healing of women, but healing of us all, you know, whatever we can do to help lift each other up and make you be a better you is something that I'm committed to. And so that's where my poetry centers right now. What are your two topics that you are most focused on right now?
So I think one thing that is really important for me, and it's emerged more and more in the work that I've done with people that traditionally have come to a place of feeling like their story isn't supposed to be heard, right? Like we may feel like we can do that. And maybe in this group, in this room, we write a lot and we may publish and we may send a lot of things to wonderful organizations like Self-Narrate, right? To have our stories come to bear on the social structures that we feel are impacting our lives. And there's a lot of people that I've come to know through my work, especially with traditionally marginalized and incredibly, I haven't really seen oppression right in front of me, especially in this community, like I've seen within justice-involved spaces. And story, it seems like it's a privilege, right? Even to be reflecting on one's own story, to find oneself in space within a larger narrative that's going on all around them. And we're not just having individuals in our communities left behind in terms of social progress, but even in the story of our city, these are individuals that are invisible. And so to be able to just turn that knob just a couple of clicks to say, well, I'm again, I give full credit, so as an academic, and give full citation to Brandon Telg and Sharon Jones. Your story matters, right? And not everyone realizes that. Not everyone realizes. I have a T-shirt that I consistently wear that says that. So it's a reminder to me that story matters, but does everyone think that? And does everyone feel free to be able to communicate that story, and to communicate stories about food insecurity and lack of housing and lack of being able to reintegrate into a community once you've been formally incarcerated? And even just thinking, can I cross this particular boundary line in this city and go feel comfortable there? Can I come to Changeville, right? I don't know. I invited some people, gave them some tickets. Maybe they'll come, maybe they won't. But if they do, I think they will see something that I know they will feel very much at home with. But it's kind of this social permission to be able to do so. So that's one aspect of story. The other aspect of it that I really kind of personally, and I'm glad I'm, kind of in the company of poets here. It's a space that I haven't really explored as much throughout my personal writing life, but it's probably because I never found, like, my poetic sensibility didn't really come forward until it came through the stories of other people. So often when I take stories, and this also began in the work I started doing with Self-Narrate, to do a lot of oral history work, and when that work produced story, and when I was able to analyze it and code it and do all of these very dry academic things with it, I realized that the themes that emerged, the phrasing, the way that words kind of grew off the page and kind of into my consciousness, they became something else. And so what I've started to do is kind of develop these narrative poems, I call them, because they're based on the words of other people, and they're crafted into a different kind of expression that is almost kind of an invocation, right? It's like spell casting. It's something that produces something in space. It's a power that may not be there when someone just tells. There's a certain kind of power that happens there, but there's a certain kind of power that comes through when those words are reframed, when they're reshaped, when they're molded kind of collectively. So it's kind of a co-creative, co-constructivist approach. I do this with individuals, and sometimes, and especially for individuals from whose stories those poems are derived, they are, Sharon, as you said, they become a different lens with which they see, or through which they see themselves. So those are the two kind of foci for me.
Two themes. The first one would be highlighting the hypocrisy of the inhumanity of humanity. And the second one would be all of the stories of the people of the African diaspora, past, present, and future, unapologetically. I have a commitment to take people when we talk about the people of the diaspora, I'm talking about taking people who are constantly made invisible and only seen through other lenses, and they're usually lenses of appropriation or profit. So those lenses are so wrong. And seeing all the different aspects. And when I talk about race and racism, I have to always say, let's talk about social conditioning of race and racism. So you've either been conditioned to think of as, because of the systems and the institutions, as an oppressed person, or you've been conditioned to act as an oppressor. And until we acknowledge that, we're going to continue this for 400 more centuries. And so my focus is to tell these different stories. I have a poem that I'm almost completed called Wade in the Water, and it's talking about the Hurricane Katrina, which was one of the worst forced mass migrations of Black people that's happening in the United States, that we haven't dissected the different levels on that. So that's the kind of thing that I like to highlight in my poems. I'll talk about that. I'll talk about all the we've been desensitized to killing Black children, being killed, teenagers. But I want to tell their story about everything that family is missing because that person isn't there. I'm not just going to talk about the bullets. I'm going to talk about this person was a person that passed down the recipes, and now that's no longer there. This was the griot in the family, the storyteller. Now you've taken the history for generations. I'm going to tell, this was the comedian. This was the person that took all the pictures, and that person's missing. And this is what the world is not going to have because that person's not there. I'm going to make you think, and I'm going to drop some history in there, and I'm going to drop some symbolism, and I'm going to make it beautiful, And so my focus is Blackness and inhumanity.
Beautiful. So that's a really deep question. I'm like thinking the whole time, what am I going to say? These first two questions. I'm sorry, I keep on bringing it back to comedy every time the mic comes from you guys. Are super serious, and I'm like, ha ha. But what I'm about to say is very serious. So there is a anti-Muslim situation happening in the world. From this humanitarian situation in Yemen, the anti-Muslimness in India, the Muslim ban here, Kashmir. What am I forgetting, Debbie? I mean, there's like two more. I was in my Islamic pop culture class. The Uyghurs. That's a big one. Genocide of the Uyghurs in China. It's just this mass haterade, I guess, but killing people, which is terrible. So that's kind of. It's difficult for me because it's something that obviously I'm super passionate about, is this concept of, like you were saying, shared humanity. When does a person become not a human anymore because of their race, their ethnicity, or their religion? And so that has been very difficult because it keeps getting up higher and higher, and then the powers that be are just feeding it that it's okay. And I will say today I was at a Frank, which is a social justice conference, and I feel like great because, I hear and see and deal with all this, but all of those 300 people there were all about good and how to change people and how to understand people. And one thing that really stuck with me from something that one of them said, Cheryl Fuller, I think she's from Radcom, she said, you cannot help or tell someone else's story if you are suppressing your own. And that really stuck with all of us. And I wonder about these leaders that have lost their humanity. What is it about their own story that that they're suppressing, that is causing this? And how do we change it? Because we all the time feel hopeless, right? How can we make these changes? So, just like this story goes, one person at a time. And that's what I try to do with the people I meet here, with the students I meet when I'm traveling, and of course, most importantly, with my films to do for a mass audience. So that's one. And then two, encouraging, because I work with, I call them kids. I know you're not kids, but they're little kids, 19-year-olds. But they're very unsure of themselves in college, and they don't know who they are, what story they want to tell, and it's okay to tell their own story when you're saying story matters. So what's big for me is trying to get them to put it on the page in terms of their story through art. And so that's something that's really important. Like they always try to I'm going to tell this action movie, and it's going to be this, and it's going to be that. And I'm like, that's great, but who is the character? What does a character want? And then your character is going to be honest and real if you put some of yourself in it. It doesn't have to be you, but tell us what you know, because we as audiences, we want to see that, and we want to hear that, and we want to relate to that so we can bring back that shared humanity.
Well, my final question is, what do you tell the up-and-coming storyteller? What do you tell? What provocation do you give to that storyteller? What assignment do you give to that person? Whether it is a kid, a 19-year-old, or, an elder, somebody who is older than you but are finally starting to find their voice. What do you tell them? What assignment do you give that person?
So for me, that's an interesting question because it's a often in the context I'm in, it's not a space in which I'm kind of encouraging someone to tell a story because they have it's like I said before, they don't have a pre-existing value for it, right? Their story is not something that they necessarily want to communicate because it's buried under layers of shame and regret and just a sense of having made mistakes, because the mistakes of that individual's life are most often what's reflected to them, right? So that becomes their story. Their offenses, their crimes, their transgressions, whatever the case is, that is the telling of this person's life. And to be able to help them to find a different story within that overarching narrative, it's to also find a value within themselves, right? So it's a sense of self-worth. It's a sense of belonging to a larger community, and that your story is a part of that larger community. And that's not really something that, like I said, there are spaces in this community where individuals don't feel like they can go because it's not their community, right? And their community boundaries have been defined for them, or as in the case of Pleasant Street, they've been defined elsewhere, right? They've been pushed in one direction or the other. So often my way in there is, it's the question, I guess, but it's not really a question as much as it is a kind of easing into that space. Is not so much what is your story or how are you going to tell your story or what is your stance in telling that story, but who is telling your story. And often that is a moment of dissonance that is devastating, but nevertheless it is a very powerful release, because often there is an admission in that moment that someone else is telling that story. And for me, that was something I had to accept about my own story for many years, that I'd given my power to others. Others had told my story. And it came from the same family of doctors all the way through individuals in relationships, individuals in the academy telling me what I should and shouldn't do with my knowledge and my assets and whatever the case is. And it's when I claimed my story that I found myself having the privilege to be able to sit here and do this work. So that's an empowerment. It's not an easy path to get to, and it's not an easy admission to make that my story is being authored by someone else. So self-authorship's not an easy goal, but man, when people get there, they don't look back.
What would I tell them? Understand the responsibility attached to telling your story in whatever art form that you share it in. I think we've had a lot of irresponsibility. No, we've had a lot of people who are not artists being highlighted. Because when you're an artist, you study your craft. You can compose it. You can break it down. You know who the masters are. You've written it. You can then compose something new from it because you already, I tell them all the time, I said, you can't write a story if you don't know the alphabet. The same way people don't understand how if you don't know music, you can put together a chord, you can't create anything new. So we can create things new too. So I think one is to study your craft. Be intentional. I'm intentional with every single word that I use. Make it beautiful. Write it again. Revise. That's true. Write it again. How can I make it more beautiful? Be authentic. Because when you're authentic, people can feel you. And you have to do it for the art's sake first. And people react to authenticity. And they know when you're passionate about it, and they know when they can feel it. And when people can feel and they're moved, you've done your job as an artist.
So I'm going to go back to the Chelsea Fuller comment, which was you can't be successful until you suppress your own story. So I would say to them, tell your own story. And the thing is that there are so many things stopping people, like you were saying, Syraj, from telling your own story. There's fear, there's judgment, there's all these things, or not being ready, which is also okay. But to tell your own story, even if it's to yourself, putting it on the page, that makes a huge difference into who you are as a storyteller and what you will become later if it's in the drawers forever. Another thing that I tell my students, like they don't want to tell their story, or actually when they're practicing their stories, I tell them to go to strangers. And when they're working on pitches, and I'm like, go to a stranger, and the University of Florida is very kind. They'll be so happy for you to do this. And then tell them your 5-minute story. And then afterwards, ask them, what emotion did you get from this? What character did you attach to? What journey did you take from it? And that is a great way to learn and to understand how to tell your story, is by reaching out to others. I'm a very community-based person. I hate being by myself. I always have to be surrounded by people. That's just kind of who I am. And I guess extrovert in that way. I feed off of others. And I feel that because, again, we all have stories to tell. And I feel that when you tell your story, you'll learn from their story, and you'll learn how to tell better stories in that way.
And just as we finish up, my task or assignment to the would-be storyteller is always be your most authentic self and never apologize for it. You may hurt a feeling sometimes. You might offend someone's very sensibility, but that doesn't mean that who you are and what you have to say is invalid or wrong. There's no way to please everyone. Please yourself. And the sooner we as individuals figure that out, the better. It does not mean that you are not community aware, that you're not humanistic, that you don't have love for another person. But what it does mean is that you have taken the time to get to know yourself, and therefore you can help someone else in the most authentic way possible. So that's it.